The small wooden cigar box my father left in the attic held nothing but yellowed tax forms and a handwritten note. The note said in his shaky cursive, "Don't trust your brother. He's been stealing from you and the company. Save yourself." 2 years later, that very box sits on my desk in the corner office of Marchetti Construction Group, and every Monday at 8:00 a.m., my brother Paul walks through the door, lays a progress report on my blotter, and calls me boss. My name is Angela Marchetti. I turned 60 the day my brother fired me. For 3 decades before that, I was the sole bookkeeper for the family construction company that our father built from a single backhoe and a handshake. I had no title on the door, no business cards with my name, no profile on the company website. I was the back office, the quiet machinery that kept the lights on and the lien waivers filed. My father, Salvatore Marchetti, started Marchetti Construction in 1978 with a used case 580 backhoe he bought at auction for $9,000. He was an Italian immigrant who worked concrete forms until his fingers bled, and he raised both of us inside the business. Paul was the golden boy, the one with the easy smile, and the gift for turning a zoning variance into a subdivision approval. I was the one who understood the numbers. At 19, I taught myself double-entry accounting from a library book because my father couldn't afford a CPA. By 22, I was reconciling the job cost ledgers, filing quarterly 941 payroll tax returns, managing the prevailing wage certified payrolls for public works jobs, and negotiating the equipment lease buyouts. I didn't date much. I didn't take vacations. I deferred my own salary more times than I can count, sometimes going 6 months on a draw that barely covered my mortgage, because Paul swore the cash flow would even out and my 50% equity stake would make it all worth it someday. That was the promise. A handshake deal with my father, reaffirmed every Christmas Eve over a glass of vermouth, that when he retired, the company would split between us. 50-50. Equal partners. 3 days before I turned 60, my father died in his sleep. Heart failure, the doctors said. He was 81 and had been slowing down, but still came to the yard every morning to sit in his pickup and watch the crews roll out. I found him in his recliner, the television still on a classic car auction, his reading glasses resting on his chest. By noon, the funeral home had collected the body. By 4 o'clock, my brother Paul and his wife Karen were in my father's living room with a manila envelope, a notary's seal, and a stack of documents that they said would simplify the transition. I was still in a fog, moving through the rooms of my father's house like a ghost, touching the things he'd touched. I walked into his study, a small wood-paneled room that smelled of double-mint gum and sawdust, where he kept his old building code manuals on a sagging bookshelf. The room was dim, the only light a brass desk lamp with a green glass shade. I ran my fingers over the spines of the code books, their covers cracked and faded, and I remembered sitting on his knee while he explained the difference between a bearing wall and a partition. I was about to leave when I noticed something out of place, a gap behind the 1987 Boca code volume, the thickest book on the shelf. I reached in and pulled out a small wooden cigar box, the kind my father used to buy from a newsstand in Newark, a Toscano box made of dark walnut, the lid inlaid with a faded decal of a clipper ship. It was heavier than it looked, and the brass clasp was worn smooth from years of opening. I held it for a moment, breathing in the faint scent of tobacco and old paper. At that moment, Paul walked into the study, phone pressed to his ear, his voice lowered but urgent. He glanced at the box, frowned, and said, "Dad's junk, just toss it. We need to talk about the equity group." He turned on his heel and walked out without waiting for an answer. I tucked the box under my arm, feeling the weight of it against my ribs, and carried it to the small bedroom where I'd been staying, the one with the twin bed and the cross-stitched psalm above the dresser. That night, after Karen had set out a cold-cut platter and a 3-page asset transfer summary on the dining room table, I sat on the edge of that bed and opened the box. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, the papers were packed tight, filling every inch of the space. I lifted out the top layer, yellowed copies of the original Articles of Incorporation dated 1978, the signatures of my father and a witness in blue ink that had faded to a pale wash. Beneath those, a stack of payroll registers from the mid-90s, the dot matrix paper still attached with perforated edges, the names of long-gone laborers and carpenters typed in columns, their hourly rates and overtime hours meticulously recorded in my father's hand. And at the very bottom of the box, tucked against the walnut lining, a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded once. I unfolded it and recognized my father's handwriting, heavy and deliberate, the same hand that had written checks and signed lien waivers for 40 years. The note said, "Do not trust your brother. He has been stealing from you and the company. Save yourself." Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family loyalty should never come at the cost of your own dignity and financial security. The manipulation began before the funeral flowers had lost their crispness. 2 days after my father's burial, Paul and Karen sat me down at the mahogany dining table in his house, a table I'd eaten at every Sunday for 20 years. The room was filled with the cloying scent of lilies and the faint whisper of Karen's silk blouse as she moved. She wore a white linen pantsuit and kept a leather planner color-coded to the half-hour. She was the type of woman who referred to herself as an executor of intentions and used words like synergy without irony. Paul did most of the talking, his voice a low, soothing rumble that he'd perfected on nervous town planning boards. He explained that the company's operating agreement had been updated 2 years earlier, after my father's minor stroke, to reflect Paul as the sole managing member with full authority to sell. He pushed a document across the table, a thick booklet bound with a brass fastener, the pages dense with legal language. I, according to this new agreement, was classified as a non-equity employee, a W-2 administrator with no membership interest, no ownership stake, and no claim on the proceeds of any sale. My deferred salary, all those years I took 50 cents on the dollar and plowed the rest back into equipment loans and payroll, was characterized as gifted labor and voluntary familial contributions. Karen slid a pen across the polished wood, the pen rolling to a stop next to my coffee cup. "We'll set up a caregiver trust for you, sweetie. You'll never have to worry about a thing." I felt the cold creep up my spine, starting at the base of my neck and spreading down my arms. But I kept my face slack, my eyes slightly unfocused, like a woman who hadn't slept in days. I let my hands tremble, not entirely feigned, and I spoke in the soft, hesitant voice of a woman who had just lost her father and wasn't thinking clearly. I said my mind was foggy, that I needed time, that I couldn't process legal documents right now. Paul's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing in his cheek, but Karen patted my hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, take all the time you need, and why don't you move into our guest house? You shouldn't be alone in that big old house." I agreed because staying in their orbit meant access. Access to their calendar, their phone calls, the panic in Paul's voice when he thought no one was listening, and the locked filing cabinet in the basement office he'd converted from an old wine cellar. That night, I packed a single suitcase and moved into the guest house, the cigar box hidden inside a pillowcase. The guest house was a converted pool cabana with a kitchenette, a futon couch, and a sliding glass door that looked out on Karen's English rose garden. It smelled faintly of chlorine and old paint. They'd installed a security camera above the garage that covered the courtyard, but I'd spent 30 years as the invisible bookkeeper, and I knew how to watch without being seen, how to move through spaces leaving no trace. I memorized the camera's field of view, the rough dead spot near the boxwood hedge where the motion sensor light didn't reach. I started taking notes in a small spiral notebook I kept in my purse, writing down times, snippets of conversation, anything that might matter later. Within the first week, the financial red flags were as obvious as a fire alarm. Paul was on his phone constantly, pacing the flagstone patio in his monogrammed slippers, his voice bouncing from forced charm to barely contained panic. He was dodging calls from a 302 area code, which I traced with a quick Google search on my phone to a Delaware private equity firm called Fortitude Capital Partners. I found a crumpled term sheet in the kitchen recycling bin one morning, under coffee grounds and a torn envelope, a buyout offer for $2. $4 million contingent on a clean balance sheet, no outstanding tax liabilities, and an unencumbered ownership structure. The due diligence window was 45 days, and Fortitude's analysts were already crawling through the payroll records. I flattened the term sheet against the counter, photographed it with my phone, then put it back exactly where I'd found it, coffee grounds and all. Karen had already bookmarked a timeshare in Cabo San Lucas on her laptop, the one with the swim-up bar and the private concierge. I saw it when her browser opened to the page during breakfast while she poured skim milk into her coffee. Then I heard the phrase that told me I was in a fight for my life. It was a Thursday afternoon, the house quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. I was in the laundry room off the main house, pressing Paul's dress shirts on a steam ironing board I'd set up so I'd have a reason to be inside at odd hours. The room smelled of starch and hot cotton. I had the iron half raised when Paul walked past the open door, his Bluetooth earpiece glowing, and said, "Look, the payroll tax thing is ancient history. We classified the bookkeeper as a 1099 for years. The IRS hasn't blinked. Just don't let them pull the 941s from 2012 to 2020. A pause. I held my breath and kept the iron moving in slow, even arcs. "No, you don't understand. We never remitted the employer share. Almost a decade. But nobody's looking." I finished the shirt, my hand steady as a surgeon's, and hung it on a padded hanger. The employer share of Social Security and Medicare taxes, what the IRS calls the trust fund recovery penalty, is 6.2% and 1.45% of every dollar an employee earns, and the employer must deposit it along with the employee's withheld portion on a semi-weekly or monthly schedule. If you don't, and you're caught, the IRS can assess a penalty of 100% of the unpaid tax against any responsible person who willfully failed to collect or pay it. That penalty attaches to you personally, not the corporation, and it's not dischargeable in bankruptcy. I knew this because I'd spent 3 decades filing those forms, calculating those deposits, and signing the checks. My brother hadn't just been shorting the IRS. He'd been setting me up as a 1099 independent contractor for over a decade, which meant he'd never withheld any Social Security or Medicare from my fake contractor checks and never filed W-2s. More importantly, he'd never paid the employer side. If I was classified as an employee all those years, which I clearly was under the IRS's 20-factor common law test, then Paul was staring down a $500,000 liability and possible criminal exposure under 26 U.S. Code Section 7202. I unplugged the iron, wrapped the cord loosely around my hand, and started planning my next move. That evening, I went back through the cigar box with a more deliberate eye. I'd been so stunned by the note that I hadn't fully examined the payroll registers. I sat cross-legged on the futon, the box open beside me, and spread the old dot matrix pages across the cushion. They were quarterly payroll summaries from the mid-1990s, the years when I was first learning the books. My father had kept a parallel record, I realized, a handwritten log of every week's actual hours worked and cash paid, stapled to the computer-generated reports. For my own entries, the ones from 1995 to 1997, I saw my name listed under a column labeled Admin. W-2, with my full Social Security number correctly entered and the proper withholdings calculated. That was the year my father had insisted on doing the taxes himself, sitting with me at the kitchen table to explain how the trust fund recovery worked. He had known. He had known even then that Paul might try something, and he had documented the truth and hidden it in this box. I cross-referenced a few weeks against the 1099 forms I'd seen in the basement. The gross amounts matched, but the tax treatment was a lie. I felt a cold, clarifying anger settle in my chest. A household accident gave me my opening. It was a Monday morning, and a corroded brass elbow on the main water line in the basement had finally given out, spraying a fine mist over the drywall near Paul's office. Paul came upstairs in a panic, unable to find the shut-off valve, flailing with a crescent wrench like a man who'd never held a tool in his life. Karen was shrieking about her stored holiday decorations getting soaked, boxes of glass ornaments disintegrating into a soggy mess. I slipped down the basement stairs, walked to the water heater, and found the main shut-off valve behind a cobweb. I gave it one hard crank to the right, and the hissing stopped. Then I told them I'd fix the pipe myself, that I used to help Dad with rough-ins on job sites, just needed an hour or two to clear some space around the office. Paul, desperate and useless, actually looked relieved. He handed me a roll of Teflon tape and a rusty pipe wrench and retreated upstairs to his phone calls. For the next 2 hours, while a plumber who didn't exist was ostensibly on his way, I was alone in Paul's basement. The room was cool and damp, the concrete floor stained with decades of watermarks. The filing cabinet was a 4-drawer Han vertical, battleship gray, with a single keyhole lock on the top drawer. It was the same kind of lock I'd learned to pick at 17, when my father lost the key to the petty cash box on a job site in Edison and taught me how to rake the pins using a tension wrench made from a windshield wiper blade and a half bobby pin. I always carried a small kit in my purse, a leather case the size of a cigarette lighter, a habit I'd never broken. I knelt on the cold concrete, slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, and applied gentle clockwise pressure. I took the rake pick, scrubbed the pins 3 times, and felt the satisfying click as the plug rotated. The drawer slid open with a soft metallic sigh. Inside the top drawer, behind a folder of vehicle titles and expired insurance binders, I found a green 3-ring binder labeled Payroll Reconciliation, 2011-2021. I pulled it out, set it on the floor, and began photographing every page with my phone. The binder told the whole story in black and white. For over a decade, Paul had issued me 1,099 MISC forms while I worked 40 to 50 hours a week in their office, on their equipment, under his direct supervision. He'd never withheld my Social Security or Medicare taxes, and more damaging, never paid the employer's share of those taxes to the IRS, even though he'd filed quarterly 941 forms that falsely reported the wages and withholdings. The actual tax deposits had been siphoned into a money market account at an online bank, an account that only Paul controlled. I found the monthly statements behind the binder in a manila folder labeled Reserve. I cross-referenced the account number with the term sheet still folded in my pocket, tracing the flow of funds with my finger. The Fortitude Capital buyout was contingent on a tax clearance letter from the IRS, a standard due diligence item that meant the IRS would review the company's last 3 years of employment tax returns. A single examination would uncover not just the unpaid taxes, but the pattern of fraud, the forged W-2s, and the money market side account. The total unpaid employer taxes, plus interest and penalties, would easily reach $740,000. The deal would be dead the moment the Fortitude analysts opened the binder. But there was more. Tucked inside the same drawer, behind the binder, was a document I recognized immediately. An amended and restated operating agreement for Marchetti Construction, LLC, dated 2017. It had my father's signature on the last page, supposedly witnessed and notarized, that removed me as a member and transferred my 50% interest to Paul for nominal consideration of $1. I held the document up to the bare bulb overhead. I'd spent 30 years looking at my father's signature on checks, on contracts, on the Christmas cards he sent to suppliers. The slant was wrong. The loop on the capital S in Salvator was too wide, the terminal stroke too long. The pressure was inconsistent, the kind of penmanship you see when someone is tracing from another document. The ink had the faint purple cast of a photocopy toner, not the blue ballpoint my father always used. I photographed that too, every page, including the notary seal that I later, through a quiet phone call with the county clerk's office, confirmed belonged to a notary who had died in 2015. It was a clumsy forgery, and it would unravel with a single expert handwriting analysis. The final piece of the puzzle came from the cigar box itself, which I'd been keeping under the mattress in the guest house inside a zippered pillow protector. When I'd first opened the box, I'd been fixated on the note and hadn't examined the other papers carefully. Now, with the money market statements fresh in my mind, I went back through them with a forensic eye. Under the yellowed payroll registers was a document I'd overlooked, an original shareholder agreement for the company, then still a subchapter S Corporation, dated 2003. It was typed on the letterhead of a now-defunct law firm in Morristown, the paper slightly foxed at the edges. It was signed by my father, by Paul, and by me. I didn't remember signing it, but there was my signature, shaky but clearly mine, notarized at a bank branch in Morristown with the bank's stamp and a notary's signature that I could still picture, a cheerful woman named Dolores who always offered me a peppermint. The agreement granted me a 30% equity stake, not 50%, but it was fully vested, irrevocable, and subject to a buy-sell provision at fair market value. More importantly, it contained a unanimous consent clause. Any transfer of ownership, any sale of assets exceeding 20% of the book value, any merger or acquisition, required the affirmative vote of all shareholders. I'd been a shareholder for 20 years, and Paul had buried it. I held the document in my hands, feeling the weight of it. This single agreement meant that Paul's entire sale to Fortitude Capital was impossible without my signature. My signature was the one thing he was never going to get. I climbed out of the basement that afternoon, the pipe repaired with a new brass elbow I'd bought at Home Depot during a quick run, the joint sweat-soldered and wrapped tight. I washed the metal dust off my hands in the laundry sink and felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew I needed an ally, not a family member, not a friend who'd been wined and dined by Paul, but someone with institutional authority. That night, I called Frank Lerner, a tax attorney in Parsippany whose name I'd seen on the letterhead of the company's old corporate returns. I'd met him once, at a holiday party 15 years earlier, and remembered that he and my father had played box together in a league in Caldwell. I sat in the dark of the guest house, phone pressed to my ear, and told him everything in a low, steady voice. I told him about the 1099, the forged agreement, the money market account, the cigar box, and the note. Frank listened for 20 minutes without interrupting, the only sound the faint tick of his pen on paper. Then he said 3 words. "I'll call Alina." Alina Ruiz was a senior investigator with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division out of Newark, a small woman with iron gray hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. Frank set up a meeting at a diner off the turnpike, a place with sticky vinyl booths and coffee that could strip paint, chosen because it was anonymous and never busy that early in the morning. I arrived before dawn, the parking lot still dark, and ordered a cup of black coffee to steady my hands. Alina arrived in a navy blazer, her badge on a chain around her neck, and she didn't smile. She sat across from me, pulled out a yellow legal pad and a digital recorder, and said, "Tell me everything. Start with the cigar box." I laid out the binder, the photographs, the forged operating agreement, the original shareholder agreement, and the money market statements. I explained the 1099 scheme, the missing employer taxes, the false 941 filings, and the Fortitude Capital buyout. I told her about the dead notary and the traced signature. She listened without reaction, her pen moving steadily. When I finished, she set down her pen, switched off the recorder, and said, in a flat tone, "The total employment tax liability, including interest and the trust fund recovery penalty, is approximately $740,000. That's not a civil matter. That's willful failure to collect and pay over taxes, a felony under Section 7202. If we can prove the forgery, that's additional state fraud charges." She paused, then looked at me directly. "We've been building a case against Fortitude Capital for a pattern of turning a blind eye to dodgy books on their acquisitions. If you can help us get inside their due diligence process and document the misrepresentations, we can shut down the sale and press charges against your brother. But you'll need to keep your cover until the closing, and you'll need to wear a wire for the final meeting." She slid a small black device across the table, no bigger than a thumb drive, and showed me how to activate it with a double tap. I agreed on 2 conditions. First, I wanted to be the one to light the match. Second, I wanted the right to buy the company's distressed debt when the deal collapsed. Alina nodded. "We can work with that. Just don't sign anything, don't lie to them directly, and keep your phone recording everything else. This will take a few weeks to coordinate." Frank drew up a limited power of attorney that allowed me to act on my shareholder rights while protecting my identity from immediate exposure. We set a timeline. The maximum cruelty beat came 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon. I'd been carefully managing my cover, playing the foggy, dependent sister, eating meals with them when invited, asking vague questions about the estate while never signing anything. I'd also, on Frank's advice, started documenting everything in a contemporaneous journal, time-stamped entries recounting every conversation, every threat, every paper slid across the table. I had the recording app on my phone set to trigger with a single tap on the volume button, and I kept it running whenever I was in their presence. My medical preparation for this beat came from my own file. I'd been on a low-dose blood pressure medication, lisinopril, for mild hypertension. I stopped taking it for 3 days, watched my numbers climb with a home cuff I'd bought at CVS, and researched the symptoms of a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke. Sudden dizziness, slurred speech, numbness on one side, a drooping eyelid. I rehearsed it in the bathroom mirror for hours, until my face looked genuinely panicked, the muscles on the right side slackening exactly the way the medical videos showed. At 2:15 p.m., Paul and Karen were in the living room, huddled over a laptop reviewing the final purchase agreement with a Fortitude associate on video link. The room smelled of Karen's floral perfume and the ozone-sharp scent of the laser printer that had been running all morning. I walked in from the guest house, shivering slightly in a thin cardigan, and said I felt a little dizzy, my voice slurring just a fraction. Paul glanced up, said sit down then, and went back to the screen without a second look. I took 2 steps into the room and collapsed. I let my body go completely limp, hitting the Persian rug sideways, my arm twisted under me, my eyes fluttering and unfocused. I made small, guttural sounds, the kind that suggest neurological distress, a strangled that filled the sudden silence. Karen looked up from her laptop, said, "Oh my God," and then didn't move. Her hands hovered over the keyboard but didn't leave it. Paul stood, a folder in his hand, and stepped over me. His foot nudged my shoulder, not hard, but he didn't slow down. I felt the brush of his loafer against my cardigan sleeve, and my entire consciousness narrowed to that single point of contact. He walked to the desk in the corner, grabbed a notary stamp from the drawer, and turned back to Karen. "Call 911 if you want, but I need her signature on this consent before the wire transfer deadline at 4. His voice was flat, businesslike, utterly without panic. He didn't kneel. He didn't check my pulse. He didn't even look at my face. He was staring at the consent form with the intensity of a man watching his whole future dissolve. Karen said, her voice thin, "Paul, she's really hurt." He didn't answer. I held the act for 15 more seconds, the longest 15 seconds of my life, my cheek pressed into the wool fibers of the rug, listening to the sound of Paul shuffling papers. Then I coughed, a wet, ragged sound, rolled onto my side and groaned. Paul's relief was audible, a short exhale, but it was a business relief. "You scared us, Angie. Take it easy." He already had the pen in his hand, a silver Mont Blanc, extending it toward me. I kept my eyes half closed, my breathing shallow, and said I needed water. Karen finally stood and walked to the kitchen with the weary air of a woman inconvenienced. The whole exchange was recorded on my phone in the pocket of my cardigan, the audio clear as a bell. The thud of my body hitting the rug, the scuff of Paul's shoe, his cold words. I listened to it twice that night in the darkness of the guest house, my hands trembling with something that wasn't fear. That was the moment any residual family loyalty turned to ash. I had watched my brother step over my body as casually as he'd step over a puddle, more concerned with a notary stamp than with whether his sister was dying. The audio recording would later be played in court, and the jury's faces would go pale. The confrontation came the following Friday, a date chosen by Alina Ruiz. Paul and Karen drove me to a branch of First Mercantile Bank on Route 46, a low brick building with a vault door in the lobby and a glass-walled conference room in the back. The Fortitude Capital deal was scheduled to close that afternoon by simultaneous signing and wire transfer. The bank's commercial lender was on speakerphone from the regional office, her voice tinny and tense. A Fortitude associate was on a video link from Delaware, his face a pale oval on a large monitor mounted on the wall. The notary, a cheerful woman in a cardigan named Marge, was already seated at the table, her stamp and journal ready. I was wearing the same navy suit I'd bought for my father's funeral, and the weight of it felt like armor. I was told I needed to sign 2 documents. The first was a consent to release the beneficiary designation on a Keeman Life Insurance Trust that my father had set up years earlier, a policy that would pay out $600,000 directly to the company upon his death. The second was a transfer of my shares to Paul, the very shares I now knew I owned. They'd even prepared a separate resignation and release that waived any claim I had to back wages, deferred salary, or employment claims. A full clean sweep. Karen had placed the documents in neat stacks, each flagged with a colored sticky tab, her leather planner open to a checklist. I sat at the polished cherry table, my hands folded in my lap. The wood was cool and smooth under my palms. Paul was beaming, his smile as wide and empty as a billboard, his tie loosened just enough to look relaxed and in control. Karen stood behind him, clutching her leather planner against her chest like a shield, her knuckles white. "Just sign, Ange," Paul said, his voice a syrup-thick imitation of brotherly care. "Then you can rest. We'll take care of you from here on out. You don't need to worry about anything." I picked up the pen, a heavy silver roller ball. I held it over the signature line for 3 full seconds, the nib hovering, and I watched Paul's smile flicker at the corners. Then I set the pen down with a soft click on the glass tabletop. I looked him in the eye and I said, my voice calm and even, "You shouldn't have made it personal, Paul. What are you doing?" I stood up. I was wearing flats, but I felt 10 feet tall. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You misclassified me as an independent contractor for over a decade. You failed to remit employer Social Security and Medicare taxes, which is a felony under 26 U.S. Code Section 7202. You forged Dad's signature on an amended operating agreement, which is fraud in the first degree under state law. The notary whose seal you used died 2 years before the date on that document, and you just stepped over my body 3 days ago because you wanted my signature more than you wanted to check if I was dying. I have it all on audio." I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the small black recording device Alina had given me, its green light blinking. "And this conversation is being recorded live by the IRS Criminal Investigation Division." The conference room door opened. 2 men in dark suits, their blazers unbuttoned to reveal holstered badges, entered first. Behind them came Alina Ruiz, holding a folded arrest warrant. The Fortitude associate on the video link made a choked sound, and his image flickered. "Paul Marchetti," Alina said, her voice like a gavel hitting stone. "You are under arrest for tax evasion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and willful failure to pay over employment taxes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." She read him his full Miranda rights while Karen started screaming, a high keening sound that sliced through the bank's quiet air. The bank officer on the speakerphone sputtered something about freezing the account, and the line went dead. The Fortitude associate said, "We're out," and the screen went black. Marge the notary closed her journal with a snap and backed out of the room. The handcuffs clicked on Paul's wrists, and for the first time in my life, I saw my brother look small. His shoulders hunched forward, his chin dropped, and the easy charisma that had gotten him through 100 town hall meetings was stripped away like a torn shirt. He was led out a side door to an unmarked sedan, and I watched through the glass until the car pulled out of the lot. The aftermath unfolded with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Fortitude Capital pulled out of the deal within the hour, citing an irreparable material adverse change. By the end of that day, the IRS had filed a formal notice of federal tax lien against Marchetti Construction LLC for $740,000 in unpaid employment taxes, penalties, and interest. The lien attached to every piece of equipment, every receivable, every dime in the company's bank accounts. The bank, a regional lender with zero appetite for scandal, accelerated the entire $380,000 commercial loan under the default clause triggered by the lien. The company was insolvent overnight, a distressed asset sitting on a banker's desk like a live grenade. That's when I made my move. Frank Lerner and I had been preparing for this moment. The bank wanted the debt off its books, and the only buyer willing to engage without a protracted workout was me. I used my savings, which included a small inheritance from my mother's estate that Paul had never known about because I'd kept it in a separate credit union under my name only, plus a loan against the cash value of the very Keeman life insurance policy that was now mine as the controlling shareholder. I offered $40,000 for the full distress debt package. The defaulted loan with its blanket UCC filing covering every piece of yellow iron in the yard, the priority IRS lien, and the right to foreclose on the company's assets under Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code. The bank's workout officer, a harried woman named Margie who had been dealing with Paul's missed payments for months, accepted my offer in 48 hours because the alternative was a Chapter 11 bankruptcy that would tie them up for years. I now held the company's debt, but I needed to own the company itself. Frank Lerner called a special meeting of the shareholders, which legally was just me, because the forged amendment was void ab initio, a legal term meaning it was invalid from the start. Even if it weren't, the original shareholder agreement required my consent for any transfer, and I had never given it. I voted to dissolve the old LLC and form a new entity, Marchetti Construction Group LLC, with me as the sole managing member. I filed the articles of organization with the state, the filing fee paid from my credit union account. I assumed the equipment leases through a new credit application, personally guaranteeing the initial 6 months until the receivables began to flow. I renegotiated the supplier contracts with the supply houses my father had used for decades, the gray bar and the lumber yard and the concrete plant, meeting each manager face to face and laying out my plan. And then I started making phone calls to the crew that Paul had laid off during his restructuring. The foremen, the carpenters, the laborers, the estimators, all of them had been bewildered by Paul's last-minute terminations, men who had worked for our family for 20 years and been handed pink slips with no warning. I called each one personally, sitting at my father's old desk in the yard office, and offered their jobs back at the same rate, with a small equity participation clause after 2 years. Every single one said yes. Through Frank Lerner, I also filed an IRS whistleblower claim under Internal Revenue Code Section 7623, which awards a percentage of recovered taxes, penalties, and interest to a whistleblower whose information leads to an enforcement action. The claim would take years to process, but Frank estimated it could net me up to 15% of the total recovery, money I'd eventually use to expand the Medical Plaza division. But that was a future windfall, not the point. The point was the company was mine, solvent and running, on the first day I walked into the office as its owner. Paul's trial was blessedly short. The evidence was overwhelming. The binder, the money market bank statements, the forged operating agreement with its impossible notary seal, the audio recording of him stepping over my body, and the testimony of Fortitude's own due diligence analyst, who admitted under oath that Paul had pressured them to skip the payroll tax review and had provided falsified 941s. Paul pled guilty to 1 count of employment tax evasion and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to 18 months in a federal prison camp, a minimum security facility in West Virginia, plus restitution of $580,000 to the IRS. Karen was convicted of conspiracy and received 5 years of probation, with asset forfeiture. Their house, the one with the guest cabana and the rose garden and the security camera I'd learned to dodge, was seized under criminal forfeiture statutes and sold at auction. The timeshare in Cabo never materialized. The day Paul walked out of prison, 22 months later with good time, he found a letter waiting at his halfway house. It was a subcontractor agreement from Marchetti Construction Group, LLC, offering him project management work on a per-job basis at standard industry rates, payable net 30 upon submission of certified payroll reports and signed lien waivers. The agreement required him to attend a progress meeting every Monday morning at 8:00 a.m. at my office, the same corner office that used to be his, the one with the drafting table that still had a coffee ring from his mug and the framed photo of our father on the wall. This morning, he came in with his report. He'd framed out the new medical office building on Route 22, 6 days ahead of schedule. His shirt was a little too tight, his eyes a little hollow, but his work was clean. He laid the folder on my desk, a manila folder with his own handwriting on the tab, and stood waiting while I opened it and scanned the earned value analysis, the daily logs, the safety inspection checklist. The numbers added up. "Thank you, Paul," I said without looking up. "That'll be all." He turned and walked out without a word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. My father's cigar box is still on my desk. I took the note out of the box and had it framed under UV-blocking glass, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Quiet competence, the kind that reconciles ledgers and picks locks and repairs burst pipes, will always outlast loud ambition. Sometimes the person who builds the business isn't the one who deserves to run it. Sometimes the quiet one in the back office has the hardest spine. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If you believe that integrity and hard work should win in the end, hit like and subscribe for more stories of justice served. See you in the next one.